So we are going to get started. If everybody could find a friend to sit with. I had to make up your bio, so I hope I got it all right. So my name is Kristen Dorsey, and I'm a member of the Freeport Sustainability Advisory Board and a member of the subcommittee known as the Tree Task Force, which for now 18 months has been laying the groundwork for standardizing and promoting tree canopy and beneficial landscape design as a fundamental infrastructure component in municipal planning, design, and development practices in Freeport. And we're really appreciative to have these two co-presenters with us tonight. Jeff Tarling was the Portland City Arborist for 34 years, and it has been calculated that he stewarded the planting of around 6,000 trees over that tenure. The most obvious showcases of his professional craft are Deering Oaks Park, Evergreen Cemetery, to name a few, where centuries-old trees also still thrive among the new growth, and the street trees that have been integrated into the expansive urban renewal and redevelopment projects taking place in Portland. Within months of his retirement, the Tree Task Force was fortunate to have a sit-down with Jeff for a Municipal Tree Management 101 primer, when he enthusiastically responded to our invitation to participate in this community lecture series. Andrew Tufts is the Bringing Nature Home program manager at Maine Audubon. That project is about restoring and rebuilding Maine's natural biodiversity by planting the native wildflowers, shrubs, and trees that support a wide array of wildlife. He grew up in Topsom, pursued an education in landscape architecture and a career devoted to landscape design, municipal planning, habitat stewardship, and landscape management, and has therefore collaborated alongside Jeff on mutual projects. We are grateful to receive their combined wisdom and expertise in the room tonight.
Great.
So, go.
So, months and months ago, we were asked to come up with a presentation for Freeport, and as we started thinking about experience that I have and Andrew from Maine Audubon, how we work together collaboratively, we've done a lot of programs with students and really trying to get students and kids out there to realize both the natural environment around them and also the climate change aspects that's affecting everyone, and then coupling that with how Maine is changing, the amount of growth taking place. So Andrew and I work together closely in the City of Portland as a planner, and I reviewed landscape plans for development, and we're trying to think ahead, how can we make the world better. The map that you see up on the screen today, that shows you where woody plants are located and forests are located in the United States. So if you think about where Freeport's located, and you realize New England, we're pretty lucky on the eastern seaboard to have the amount of vegetation we have. And just in the local community, thinking about the natural resources that Freeport still has, when you think about Wolf Neck Farm, from Harrisseekit, the seacoast, to Wolf Neck, and then on the western part of the town towards Durham, there's really a great amount of natural resource here that we already have. So I think the goal for that aspect is trying to protect the forest and open spaces that you have. And I think that's well on the way with the community. So kudos for coming out tonight to see this. But I think it's really important to keep in touch with what's going on. And so here in Maine, if you look at that map, it shows the type of growth. You can see that the northern Maine, obviously dark green. It's a lot of forest land, and that as you look at the different lands down in southern New England, the amount of development that takes place and how Maine is kind of unique. And then the population change and forest land change, and those other maps, one on the left is the population change projections, and percentage of private forest being developed by 2030. So it kind of makes me think about the forest land that we have and how precious it is, and that there's a lot of effort being made to kind of anticipate change. So last spring, I started out looking at Freeport, and this is the town line at Yarmouth on Route 1, and you can see that as you enter the town, great amount of trees that we have, the mature forest that's along the roadside. As you drive down Route 1, there's white pine, maple, there's a whole selection of trees that are part of the natural environment that have been planted years ago. But also when I stopped at one of the parking lots, I noticed this line of ash trees, and with emerald ash borer coming as a threat in southern Maine, and all of Maine for example, we could be losing trees like this. So we gotta really think ahead in the future of what trees are planted and thinking about that resiliency. And as land changes, that land use, protecting some of the existing woodlands and thinking about what goes back in its place. The train's right on schedule. And then as you come into Freeport on Route 1, the mature maples, the sugar maples that line some of the older residents are really amazingly beautiful, and that continues with the architecture of the downtown. And then the challenges, you can see a little bit of, this is probably late March, early April, and the white on the sidewalk is probably de-icing salt. And that's one of the big threats we have for downtown trees is the de-icing salt. And also in the world, all the urban areas are trying to reinvent themselves. And I think we start to see research worldwide today, as well as here in the Northeast. But this Green Cities, Good Health is a real tie today about healthy communities and how trees and landscape contribute to that. And that also makes a viable downtown. It does so many things, and there's great research out there that we can talk about later, but how trees are connected to the people and the community. And when I think about trees, whether it was Portland or anywhere, people want to see a giant big tree take its place from maybe a little cutout in the sidewalk. And this illustration shows that tree number 4 is the tree in the sidewalk planted with a tree grate. It doesn't have a lot of soil volume, so that's the size of that tree is going to be. And then tree number 2 and tree number 3 have a little bit more green space, and that's kind of the corresponding size, that tree to maturity. And look at tree number 1 in a bigger space. And I think you see that in Freeport, a lot of places where behind the sidewalk is a large lawn area and it has a large shade tree. So I think as we go forward, we want to think about how big that tree will get. And this is an example of these trees all being in the same, how big they will get. So I think as we think about the future, it's really hard to have mature trees in that little number 4 tree grate. And so in Portland, we kind of learned some tough lessons. The photo on the left was trees planted in a tree grate, and you can see all the white de-icing salt. And so out of the 11 trees at this development, we lost 9 of them. But we really learned and did raise planters in places, and we kind of increased the soil volume and protected those trees. And then on the photo on the left is kind of the typical large sidewalk area with a raised granite tree well. And the right photograph is Exchange Street in Portland, where we were sensitive to car doors opening up and not hitting that granite. So that's something we were thinking about. So we just had a little low rise on the sidewalk, and as the snow that was deposited in the wintertime, and it melts with the salt, it doesn't flow into that tree grate and become just like a seep of salt. So those trees have been in there for 9 years and are growing really well. We also look at the number of, or the amount of native plants put in our landscape. And this is a simple landscape with Amelanchier or shadbush with blueberry. And good thing about it, for maintenance crews, we planted it, and just kind of look at it once in a while to see if there's anything going on, but we didn't really have to do a lot of maintenance. So instead of having a lot of, whether it's hydrangeas and other ornamental plants, we kind of went to a basic, what's a native landscape that's going to thrive. In some of the landscapes, we put native blueberry, and then people showed up and started picking the blueberry. And it was kind of neat that instead of just having a plant there that's pretty once in a while, it's a plant that's productive, and people are actually benefiting from that. Another landscape that I've noticed that's interesting, this is at the Jackson Lab in Mount Desert Island. The plant around the parking lot is all Contonia or sweet fern. And they just put the sweet fern in, it makes its own nitrogen. They don't have to mulch it. They just kind of put the sweet fern in, let it go, and it might be a little shaggy looking, but it's just an example of native plants in a parking lot that's doing its work without a lot of cost. In Portland, we had, we mow a lot of turf. We started looking at what can we do better. And so we created, this is Franklin Street, and we created a meadow downtown, and it was a little controversial. The city manager said, let's try it, but it has to look good by a certain time when the League of Portland, all the mayors were coming to Portland. Luckily, COVID hit, and I got an extra year in. But we tarped this location. We put a tarp down. We worked with Audubon, Eric Topper and I, and we bought plants from Audubon as a plant sale. And this is year one on the right there with C and Rebecca here, and there's a lot of water. So we took an area that was mowed and trimmed every week. In fact, people would call and say, the crew goes up and mows that every week, even if it doesn't need mowing. And so here's several acres that are now a pollinator habitat landscape. So it's kind of doing its own thing without us, and it happens to be a bee flying by. I didn't get that picture when I took it. Somehow that bee got in there. Some of the threats to the forest today, we have emerald ash borer, which is really a serious threat to ash trees, and we're all going to see that decline here in the next 2 to 3 years. In Portland, you can see the map on the left, southern Maine, and a little bit up in Aroostook County. On the pictures on the right show the life cycle. It starts off as a larvae in the tree and makes this gallery, and it really cuts off the cambium, and the tree declines later on. But it's a non-native insect from Asia that's located here, and there's only a few places that have been able to stop it with biocontrol, like parasitic flies. But I'm really concerned about ash trees because they get brittle really quickly, and when they fall apart. So it's having a plan, and I think for Freeport, having an idea where your ash trees are and which ones you want to protect is a good idea. Now on the left is hemlock woolly adelgid. So we think about other tree pests that we have. That first slide showing all the forest land, but now we have emerald ash borer. I know we had brown-tailed moth here in Freeport. I'm not sure how it is this year. And then we have another exotic, which is the hemlock woolly adelgid, which is an also threat for that important conifer. The slide on the right is kind of this. It's hard to read probably from where you're sitting, but they have an idea, do you want to save the tree? And this is the steps you take if you want to save your tree, and you kind of have to do an evaluation. I think the going rate right now is $25 an inch. So if you have a caliper tree that's 10 inches, it's probably going to be about $250 to spray that tree or treat that. And that would give you 2 or 3 years of protection. So you have to kind of look in the landscape to see which trees are worth saving. We always try to look for good information out there, and you can show that these two booklets, The Natural Landscapes of Maine and Maine's Invasive Plant Field Guide, kind of help us to kind of determine what plant might grow there. And then the invasive plants, we have invasive plants in our landscape, and how do we work to kind of reduce that seed source and how it spreads. And I could look out the window and see bittersweet, and so I know we have it in all landscapes, and I just think that awareness for the community of having a plan or sharing information. But there's great information on the State of Maine website. of these different pests or these different plants and how do we control them. I guess the good part is, and you look at the ecoregions of Maine, this is kind of the makeup of what plants grow where. And then the map on the right is actually it's Freeport, and shows the amount of planning that's taking place on identifying habitat and open space land. So these exist on the Maine Natural Areas Program. So it's great to see that we're looking at these really important ecosystems in our towns and communities so we can kind of have a plan for the future. And, you know, living in Freeport, you know that it's located, you know, north of Portland. You know, when you cross Yarmouth, it kind of blends in, and same with going out towards Brunswick or heading west towards Durham. But what kind of surprises me, and even though I drive the community a lot, and I really love the resources of forest land in the community, but I look at the amount of surface parking, and I wanted to show this Google Earth picture because you see it from the street and you don't think about the parking lot that's behind a parking lot. And the importance for that isn't a negative comment as much as trees can really help shade those parking lots and reduce the heat island effect that parking lot heat gets. Think about not this week, but last Friday when it was 90, the amount of sun down in that parking lot and the heat that rises. As we think ahead for change, that adding trees to that parking lot to cool it off is really an important thing. So Andrew, want to take, yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, Jeff. So I was lucky enough to have Jeff as a mentor when I was at the City of Portland Planning Department. We worked together on a lot of fun projects, on a lot of challenging projects. I'm trying to figure out how we could, you know, make a single tree survive in some of these really challenging sites. And it was mentioned that I have a background in landscape architecture, and one of my passions really is how to bring the natural landscapes into the developed environment. And so to start, I like to discuss this criteria for evaluating landscapes around us. And there are three things I like to go through. One, ecological function. So how the landscape functions ecologically, naturally. Landscape function, so what are the functions that is performing for certain human uses, and then social and cultural functions, so such as gathering and whatnot. In the downtown of Freeport, you have a lot of social and cultural functions occurring here. And so when you're designing natural landscapes in developed areas, you really have to find a way to balance these three things. Jeff was just touching upon the idea of ecoregions and plant communities. So I like to zoom out when looking at a space and think about what, especially if it's a developed area, what was here? What has this development displaced? And so the Nature Conservancy has a really great tool. It's the Northeast Habitat Map. It's a GIS map that anyone can access online, and it shows all the ecoregions across the Northeast. And you can zoom into Freeport here, and it shows the vast majority of interior Freeport is what is called Laurentian, Acadian, pine, hemlock, hardwood forest. And the areas along Route 1 into the downtown are shaded pink, which is all depicting the developed landscape. So when you're trying to think about if you want to bring nature back into the space, into the downtown, a great place to start is look at what was once here, such as that specific ecoregion. Another great resource is Maine Natural Areas Program. This is one of the books you have in front of you looking at specific plant communities and how those plants in those communities grow together and are found together naturally. So when you have an urban environment, a developed area such as downtown Freeport, you have a few options if you're trying to move forward. One is to restore the prior ecological conditions. So if you wanted to bring the habitat that was displaced in Laurentian Acadian habitats back in, that's an option. The other, work with the current disturbed conditions. The third, which I think is a great option is assemble what would be called a novel community of native and exotic species. At Maine Audubon, we work just with native plants. We grow and sell native plants. But I include exotic plants in this description because, as Jeff has seen, in the city of Portland, when you have one of those street trees in a tiny little box in a sidewalk, there are very few straight native tree species that will grow in that kind of environment. So this is where, when you have a habitat that is completely displaced in a downtown with a lot of surface parking, trying to find a way to bring in the majority natives and then finding a certain tree that might provide shade and provide that kind of landscape function, that's the kind of hybrid environment that we are envisioning. And so to start, to document and figure out what is native to your area, I always love to talk about this resource, Native Plant Trust, their Go Botany page, and it's a wonderful resource where you can look up a specific plant, such as butterfly milkweed, and it will tell you down to the county if it's native where you live. So technically, this plant was extirpated in Maine, but it is slowly being reintroduced and is found throughout most of the state at this point because, fortunately, we have a number of growers around the state who are providing it. So this is a great place to start to figure out if it is truly native to where you are. Another resource, a little plug for us, mainenativeplants.org, and this is a wide variety of plants that we grow and sell at Maine Audubon. Another few criteria to think about. So when you are designing a landscape with natives for habitat, a few questions to ask. What do animals need? What species specifically are you targeting? And what related threats do you also need to manage? So when it comes to threats, Jeff touched on invasive species. That's the primary thing to think about in these landscapes. But as far as what you're trying to bring in and what plants to choose, a great place to start, especially in developed landscapes, are keystone species. So these are plants that attract and supply food for a huge number of caterpillars and insects that feed birds and are really the base of the trophic level. So keystone species, this picture here signals the red oak. This is kind of our showcase keystone species in Maine and New England. Red oak supports over 500 caterpillars, which of course is the primary food source for baby birds. So if you're trying to bring birds into your habitat, you want the caterpillars, and there's no greater plant out there than a red oak. And as Jeff showed, if you want a red oak in a downtown environment, you need quite a bit of space. A red oak is not a tree that will typically grow in a little tree grate, though in some spaces in Portland, you'll still see a few old red oaks that at one time had a little bit more space to grow. Continuing with keystone plants, so when you're introducing these plants, here we have both New England aster and goldenrod. These are two high-performing, high-functioning keystone plants that also have like very real aesthetic functions. As you can see, they're contrasting colors, and it's shown that actually, while it's appealing aesthetically to us, it's also appealing to pollinators. Pollinators are able to see the contrast in these complementary colors. And so when you include these kinds of complementary colors in a landscape, it actually will attract more pollinators. And building on that, what's really key in a landscape is that you create synergy. So if you're trying to bring in keystone species that attract the most number of insects, you really want to have keystone species that work with the phenology of the place. So you always want to have something in bloom, or for example, if you're trying to attract a monarch butterfly, first you must have its host plant, milkweed, and then you need to make sure that you also have the plants that are in bloom when the milkweed has gone by, and the caterpillars, which then become the new generation of butterfly, have a food source before they have to make their journey southward. So it's always important when you're trying to create food sources for insects and birds in your landscape that you have food sources through the entire season when you're developing a landscape. Because if you just have a monoculture of species, that's not going to get you anywhere. Another criteria of plant selection that I like to include especially in developed landscapes, is the aggressiveness. We like to distinguish between aggressiveness and invasive. So invasive we often use for non-native species that will outcompete natives. But natives, there are plenty of natives that have very aggressive characteristics and qualities, such as Pachyra, shown on the right there. It's a wonderful, wonderful plant that can fill in a landscape with pretty poor soils. So if you have an area that you don't have much capacity for management and maintenance, this is a plant that can really fill a great role and provide lots of food for different types of caterpillars. However, if your aim is to increase biodiversity, especially in the herbaceous understory, then you have to plan accordingly and make sure that you have the right balance of plants with specific traits of aggressiveness so that they won't outcompete the other. And then I always like to talk about, so in addition to plant communities, there are what we call landscape archetypes. Naturally, as Jeff showed, the majority of Maine, I think over 99% of the state, if left untouched, would be forest land. When you have a disturbance, say there's a fire, then that begins the process of succession. And at the beginning, it starts with grasslands. And so it's always helpful when designing a landscape to think about the balance between the different stages of succession. And in Maine, we will see grasslands or meadows, and then shrublands when smaller understory shrubs start to come in, and then finally mature forest types. And they all have their own specific aesthetic attributes as well as ecological functions. And how you arrange them in a landscape, especially a developed landscape, is really, really key and can be tricky at times. So it takes some finesse. But when trying to really achieve maximum biodiversity, these successional zones are critical. And it's actually the edges in between these successional zones where you will find the most biodiversity. So starting with grasslands and ground covers, I'll really just speak to the nature of ground covers in this presentation. But in a developed landscape, so often, especially in a downtown environment, the ground plane is kind of written off. It's mulch it and forget it. You just want to stop the weeds from coming up and let the mulch do its job. In a natural environment, there are tons of native species, native ground covers that fill that role of creating a green mulch. And this is critical for stormwater runoff, for all kinds of pollinators, and it really fills a huge role in creating a layered system that ecologically functions to its highest capacity. For example, this shows both a shade-loving ground cover, such as Tiarella, and then on the far side is wild strawberry, which is a fantastic ground cover that I can't recommend enough. Moving to shrublands or the forest edge. So this is where you will really find the greatest diversity of birds in our landscapes. Birds really gravitate to these kinds of environments, these shrublands, where you have things such as viburnums, willows, dogwoods, all keystone species that support huge numbers of caterpillars, often have fruit, so they feed both baby birds and adult birds. They provide nesting habitat, and it's really just a great way to introduce natives into a developed landscape. Particularly, I find so many of the non-natives that we have in kind of cookie-cutter landscapes, think rhododendrons, azaleas, they're assessed just for their aesthetic value, but we have plenty of native shrubs in our landscape here in Maine that could fill that place both aesthetically and functionally in a very successful way. And then finally, just always, Jeff already touched upon the forest and the canopy layer, but this is the area that provides the shade in our downtown environment. So as far as the landscape function, that's where the forest and the canopy layer is really important in providing shade and just overall habitat for birds who need spaces to nest in our environments. So, I also always like to touch upon where you can get native plants in Maine. The first thing I would say is grow them yourself. So growing from seed is probably one of the best, most accessible options you have. And we are very fortunate these days to have many more sources for actual native seeds with local ecotypes. Wild Seed Project is a wonderful organization that we are lucky enough to partner with on a variety of projects. And every year we put on seed sowing workshops just showing how easy it is to grow native plants from seeds. Granted, some are definitely much easier than others. I would recommend starting with things like asters and goldenrods. They're all very prolific. But if you're looking to source plants, source live plants, there are tons of sources now across the state that are growing live native plants. This is a picture of our hoop house at Gilsland Farm in Falmouth. Just a few weeks ago, it has been really a perfect spring for growing at the nursery. Things are just ready to get in the ground. The plant sale can't come soon enough. And this is just our nursery outside as well. This is, honestly, it feels like it's a month ahead of time right now. So it's a really wonderful experience getting to work so closely with all these different types of native plants. And we're constantly documenting all of the different insects and birds we're seeing come through this landscape all the time. This right here is a really lovely plant. It's Zizia. It does really well in part shade, but it's a pretty prolific plant that can do well in a variety of environments. And I just love the shot of the dappled sunlight hitting those yellow flowers. And then just one more shot of this wild columbine with some blue-eyed grass that will be sad to say it won't be in bloom by the time of the plant sale, but fortunately I got some pretty great shots. And then finally, for those of you who are available, we will be having our Native Plant Festival and Sale in about a week and a half on June 17th. And it's a really, really fun day. Of course, you can purchase native plants at this event. We also have a variety of speakers and partners who will be there, who will all be available to talk. And if you'd like to learn more, we have information on our website about those speakers. So with that, I'd be happy to take questions and invite Jeff back up.
Using trees and plants strategically for stormwater management in a town?
Yeah. So super important subject, especially in Portland. This is being looked at all the time through both trees, but then also how we can better use all of the green space to slow that water down when you have so much paved surface area, and especially when you're on the coast, there are very real consequences of not dealing with your stormwater appropriately. So I know in the city of Portland right now, I was just meeting with folks about thinking about how we can introduce more natives into the bioswales and rain gardens found throughout the city, but lots of opportunities for green infrastructure through rain gardens and in these, especially in tight areas adjacent to roadways where you're dealing with so much of this, but super important to have that kind of infrastructure in place. As far as trees, is there anything you'd want to add, Jeff?
Yeah, there's different scales of stormwater management. The large rain gardens, you'll see one at Back Cove at the parking lot that captures a lot of that stormwater from the parking lot before it goes into Casco Bay. It filters it out, and then it goes through a surface layer of soil that cleans it, and then the water itself goes out without just dumping it overboard. And then they have small catch basins that look like a large catch basin with a tree or a shrub in it. We're always trying to push the envelope to have a native plant or something that's going to survive. And then green roofs. We have 2 schools in Portland that, because of the funding, got extra funding for green roofs. And it's pretty amazing that all that rain that falls goes through and gets held on the roof itself before it goes just into a pipe. So I think that stormwater management comes through those different levels. And I think there's cooperative funding to help promote those aspects. Hope that gives you some idea, I guess.
Do you have best management practices, kind of things to recommend for for road salt, how to mitigate the damage from road salt, but also like in road salt, are there certain formulas that are better? Because I was also noticing, if you have those trees in boxes, then if they're not going to be able to filter out as much of the water from the street, you're protecting them from the road salt, but then you're also not getting some of that filtering opportunity. So
That's a good observation. I think in some places that the tree in a granite planter might be just trying to grow a tree for shade on that sidewalk and cooling. And then there's places where we have raised ones that filter stormwater, and then the outlet is under there into a drainage system. But I think that the challenge is on roadside, you might see white pine yellowing or spruce trees yellowing after a lot of salt. And so, the challenge for us was always managing sidewalk treatments and looking at there's better alternatives than just calcium chloride. And same with highway departments or public works departments to, manage. In the wintertime, we just think we want to have streets of black, it's snowing out, and we want to see the bare roads the next day. And then come spring, we want those trees to be green. So you got to kind of play that off. But I think, by just talking to the different groups involved, whether it's, Maine DOT does some of the state highways and how they manage it, they're pretty aware of this salt use, but I think sometimes it gets overapplied. So, and then as far as mitigating it, treating it with gypsum is a material that binds that salt up and does help.
Jeff, could you talk about what you were able to do with private property tree management in Portland as opposed to public? And could you also talk about the tree trust fund that you had in Portland?
Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. We always try to be really strong advocates in giving information to the public. And, that ranges from someone's backyard that someone wanted to know, should I save these trees or should we think about replanting and giving them the good advice? We also had a lot of large property owners that we said, wow, that's great. And including the city land, we had 1,200 acres that we managed. And we did forest management work, which was, how do you explain to a neighborhood group that you're coming in with a fella buncher and skidders and we're going to make that forest better because everybody wants to hug the trees. But we tried to look at the science, and the science would be, this is an uneven age stand, and it's all mature trees falling apart. So we would go in and thin the trees and do a lot of PR work, and then the outcome would be, wow, we see a lot of new species coming up. And I think a good example, I was on Route 1 near Skillins the other day in that little Pine Grove Park. And there was a lot of feedback from the community not to do anything for that park because there's beautiful pine trees. And they were all falling apart. But they did forest management work, and now it's starting to have a mixed stand of trees. But so going back from that is we always advocated science of forest management. And I know that the New England Forestry Foundation has that land in South Freeport. So there's good examples of forest management work. And then the second part of the question about a tree trust, I remember the first call I had from Oakhurst Dairy in the early 2000s, and they asked, what would you do with $2,000? And I said, it's $2,000 more than I had. And so my eyes got excited, and we ended up raising, almost $100,000 in tree planting money. And it just became a perpetual thing of people would donate every year, and we would take a $50 donation and cobble it together. And some of that went to community orchards. Like we started a heritage orchard for like Baldwin apples and apples that people that might not see today. And then we had larger trees that we would plant in neighborhoods that didn't have the funding. But I think the community tree trust is so important that you can leverage that money and also match it to grants. So when there's a grant available, you actually have some money. One thing that Portland did, and Andrew was aware that we had a one tree per unit tree fund. So if you were building 20-unit condo development, you could plant 5 trees in the public way, and then you had to come up with 15 trees to donate to the city. and that was $400 times 15. And it started off a little here and there, and now it became enough funds that we could plant trees in the community without looking to the taxpayers to fund that. And it's kind of an offset of the development pressure. So I think tree trust, looking at development pressures and that leveraging that fund, and then getting information to homeowners about their great forests and how to manage that is, and that's available. That's a pretty easy thing to do.
What was it, 1 tree per 10 units?
1 tree per unit.
Per unit? Okay, wow.
So when we had one that had 60 units, and they planted 5 trees, so that was a big check. And at first they were like, oh, that's money, you know, why do we have to come up with that? But I think the community really rallied behind it, seeing when you see trees being cut down and, you know, new box going up and there's nothing there, that the whole street got new trees, not just in front of that business. So it was a trade-off, but I think that as development pressure changes, that it's something to anticipate that could happen in any community, and that it's sharing it so it isn't just on the taxpayer to pay for these new trees.
So we have woolly algae in all of the hemlock all around us in the place where we live, in the forest here in Freeport. And do we just let the trees die? It's, you know, sing bye-bye to them? You know, what's the way to deal with their death?
That's a great question, and absolutely you don't want them to die. So there's biocontrol, which is a beneficial insect that feeds on woolly algae only, and it's not going to be the house flies that come in your house in the wintertime and bug you. But those are available. I know there's a couple of different companies, but going through the Maine Forest Service for advice. And so what you do is, and I think of many forests here in town, particularly Wolf's Neck, that has hemlock. It's really important to save them because it really shades the streams and some of the wooded dense areas. So I think working on whoever owns the land to get these parasitic flies out there, and I know I have 1,200 flies, little colonies coming in the next couple of weeks for a couple of projects I'm doing in Cape Elizabeth. But they're available. The Maine Forest Service will help, and if you ask me afterwards, I can give you the contact. But you can treat it obviously chemically, but you know that's the one tree you want to save. And we always start with the heritage large trees, and in Portland we had some in Baxter Woods, 42-inch size hemlocks that were 200 or 300 years old. So we treated them first to save those grandfather, grandmother trees, and we also want to save them by putting out these beneficial insects.
I'm wondering, on the topic of like resource harvest, tree cutting, who benefits, like who, I'm assuming the the logs are sold, is that going to the town or the city? And then if you think that is I don't know what word I'm looking for, a prevention of allowing the forest to succeed into a mature old growth forest, and if that's a position that we're taking.
Yeah, that's another good question. Thank you. So a lot of times the forest we were looking at had a level of non-native Norway maple that you could see them outside, and so we went after these Norway maples and said, if it's a Norway maple, that's going to be removed. And then we looked at some of the degrees of some of the, say, white pine that wasn't in great shape and that we wanted to release have new growth. And then the funding of the values, so the chip values, when SD Warren or Sappy Paper was taking chips, we would probably make a few $1,000s that we would take those funds and just put it back into the resource by replanting or just trying to make that forest healthy again. But the education part was so important of we're really thinking about sustainable forestry versus aesthetics. And you know, I think that for me even, I think we all we want a forest to be pretty, and, you know, the pine needles and the pine cone and some native plants coming up, but you think about for wildlife and habitat, having it messy is not a bad thing. So you're going to have some of that coarse woody debris on the ground for a while, and that nutrient cycle is going to go back into the forest, and it'll help that forest for the future. So I think specifically it depends on what forest it is and what condition, but a lot of the urban forests that I dealt with, you know, we bought them in the 1800s and they matured, and, you know, you think about white pine that started in a pasture in the early 1900s, grows up, and all of a sudden it starts falling apart, which some of these big storms. And, you know, I think we all look at the impact of climate change, the big storm events. Like every year we have the 100-year storm seems to happen every year versus every 100 years. So I think being resilient is really important. But I think keeping that money and putting those resources back into the forest is important. I hope that answered your question.
We have a field that's been taken over by an invasive, this Dom rocket, and it's limited, obviously, the diversity of it. Is there any way to reintroduce a native or something that's aggressive, or how would we try to bring that back?
We were just noticing that on the ride up along the side of the highways. Actually, it tends to bloom roughly similar time to the non-native lupin. Yeah, I think, you know, there are a number of ways to try to mitigate and get rid of that. And then what I would say is if you have a large area like that, so if you have a meadow, like meadow restoration is one thing, and that there's a whole process to that. And kind of we spoke to that with the arterial. But if you're doing a full-fledged meadow restoration, you know, that's a 3, 5, 7 year project. Otherwise, if you have like an area of this non-native invasive that you're trying to get rid of, reintroducing the more aggressive natives is a great way to go in the short term to try to outcompete certain plants. And we do have a variety of native plants, such as the cutleaf coneflower, our plant of the year. That is a it's a huge tall plant that of all of our herbaceous perennials, definitely one of the more aggressive ones. But I love it for that, because of all of these invasive plants we're dealing with now. It's one that we can stick out there and say, this native that so many caterpillars and birds feed upon might actually hold up against them. So, and yes, it's available at the plant sale.
Get it quick.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, thank you all.
So it is really nice to have such a great turnout on this topic. The tree task force is underway in Freeport. We meet monthly. Our agendas and minutes are posted on the town website under the sustainability board. So if you want to follow what we're doing, we do hope eventually to do a lot more with education and citizen science and monitoring. And we're charged with public trees, but of course we would hope and encourage that private citizens also will use landscaping and trees to kind of increase the canopy and all the other benefits that, you know, plantings provide for the whole community, which obviously has no borders. So thank you.